Good evening. How are you all doing? Come on, a little better. How are you all doing? All right. That's what I want to hear. It's good to be back. I missed you the last 2 weeks. There is no class next week because we couldn't have use of this room. There will be class the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and it's going to be a really good one with Van Jones. And then the class after that on the 29th, we're going to do course evaluations. I don't yet know if they're online or written, so be prepared for either. A couple other little things. There's a sign-up going around for Francis Moore Lappé's organization, Small Planet, and please put your name down on that so you can get information about it. And Frankie will also be doing a signing of her new book, EcoMind, right after class in front. I have read it. It's a very important book. I highly recommend it. So don't miss that. And I'm going to give you a clicker question, which will tie in, I think, to the conversation we're going to have with our guests. And that is, from the perspective of the environment, which is better, eggs or spinach? A, if you think it's eggs. B, if you think it's spinach. We'll get the results in a second. Yeah, the question is, from the point of view of, let's say, the environmental footprint of these foods, which is better for the environment? Eggs, A, or spinach, B? $50-50. Okay. Well, Gidon will work on that. Very interesting. You're of two minds. What we're going to do tonight in this session is something we really have not paid sufficient attention to so far in the class. We've looked at food and food politics in terms of social justice, economic issues, health issues, but we really haven't paid that much attention to the environmental impact of our food choices. And we have two guests superbly equipped to help us do that. What happens on our plate affects the natural world more than anything else we do. Okay, more than the car we drive, more than how we heat our homes. We change the world by what we eat or choose to eat or not eat. Think about, you can look at that many ways. The water pollution, air pollution, climate change, greenhouse gases. The composition of species is affected by the species we choose to favor with our agriculture and the ones we disfavor because they threaten our agriculture. So what happens when we're eating is really the most powerful engagement you have with the environment. We're going to hear from two people who've been thinking about these issues for a long time. Francis Moore Lappé, who will speak second, is a hero of mine and one of really the founders of the modern food movement. 40 years ago this year, she published a book called Diet for a Small Planet that just kind of blew the lid off how we think about food. I mean, she connected the dots between something as ordinary as a hamburger and the environmental crisis and the hunger crisis. And she really drew a line between that plate, that burger, and what was going on out in the world, whether half a world away in Africa or India or in the air above our heads. Since then, she's published a bunch more books. I don't have the number right here. The most recent one that I mentioned, EcoMind, 17 other books. There are, by the way, 3 million copies of Diet for a Small Planet in print. She's the co-founder of 3 organizations, including Food First, right here in the Bay Area, the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and more recently the Small Planet Institute, and that's the sign-up sheet you'll be getting as it comes around, a collaborative network for research and popular education seeking to bring democracy to life, which she leads with her daughter, who is also a very important leader in the food movement, Anna Lappé. In 2008, she received the James Beard Foundation Humanitarian of the Year Award for her lifelong impact on the ways people all over the world think about food, nutrition, and agriculture. She's also been a recipient of the Right Livelihood Award. Gidon Eshel is someone who I've been involved with as someone working on food issues for several years now. He's kind of my go-to guy when I'm trying to answer questions like, what is the carbon footprint of an organic salad shipped across the country, or a hamburger? How much fossil fuel does it take to make a hamburger? And he is a geophysicist who can actually give real defensible numbers to those questions. He teaches environmental science, geophysics, and applied mathematics at Bard College in New York. And his research addresses basic climate physics as well as the geophysics of food production. He holds a PhD, an MPhil, and an MA in geophysics from Colombia. And he is the author of numerous papers on these issues. But he has a really kind of fine-grained understanding of how our food choices, particularly related to meat, impact the climate. And I think what he has to tell us is going to surprise you dramatically, and I think lead you to change some of the eating choices you make. So please welcome Gidon Eshel.
The go-to guy. Thank you. Okay. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for everything. It's very nice to be here and to talk with you about it. I think it's probably the largest venue I've ever occupied. I feel a little bit like a warm-up band to U2 or something. And I wanted to start by thanking these three people. They are very, for people who recently started working on those issues like myself, I've only been around, 5 years or something. These are obviously huge heroes, and it's an honor to share the podium with them. When I got the email from Alice Waters, I spoke to my wife, and I said, I just got an email, blah, blah. And she said, wow, that's like getting a phone call from Jimmy Page, and he's asking you, what do you think about my latest tune? Or something like that. Well, that would be good, but for a guy who loves biking as much as I do and who spends countless hours on the bike, I preferred the Lance metaphor. So it's an honor to, either way, it's an honor to be here. Okay, so what I want to say can be condensed into those few sentences, and then the rest of it will be just kind of arguing and shoring up the idea. Okay, so the food system is one of the key ways human activity impacts the physical environment, and also the society, its social and economic structure, and it's clearly not without its flaws. Environmental improvements, should you strive to achieve them, sometimes lead to contradiction. Okay, you want to improve this, that undermines the other. You want to improve the other, that undermines something else. Okay, so there are different ways people respond to such conundrums. For me, the most obvious way is to compute. So that's what I do for a living. I compute. And I would like to show you some of the computation and what they tell you. And I was particularly impressed to see that there was a 50-50 in the responses between spinach and eggs, because that's the correct answer. It's kind of like, well, depends what you mean and depends exactly how you phrase it, and it's not really clear-cut. I thought that you looked me up ahead of time, you say, oh, this is the plant guy, spinach. Well, no, it doesn't work this way. But I'm impressed that you're a little more sophisticated than that. I'll give you an example of that choosing process, okay? So let me orient myself here. So suppose you subscribe to the notion that I'm the plant guy, although I'm not, okay? Then you would say, okay, given the options in the middle, okay, or given this option, which would you choose as a better one for the environment? Surely this, okay? or these other plant-based alternatives? Well, that's actually not even very clear that that's the correct answer under any definition of what's better and what is worse. But in many parts of the world, think about around here, think about Marin or Sonoma, okay, where there's definitely, in Sonoma, the houses mostly are a lot nicer than this crappy one, but still, they compete directly over land with agriculture. And if you're asking yourself, how do I keep Sonoma County as pristine as it has been, let's say, when, I don't know, my parents were married or something? The answer is a lot of it depends on how successful you are at stopping urban sprawl. And that may very well mean that choosing beef of any kind is more active in stopping that, is more effective maybe in stopping that encroachment of urban development than anything else. In that case, well, what are you going to choose? That's a complicated question that requires calculation. All right? So because of the complexity of questions like this and other ones that share the spirit of this question, I kind of, with others, I have been spearheading this new discipline of geophysics that is, you can call it geophysics of food production or computational sustainability. Either of those is okay. Now, I understand that for some of you, perhaps many, geophysics by itself is a scary enough word. Actually, it really need not scare anybody. It's just a scientific discipline. But I'll just tell you what it is. You know, if you want to know any phenomenon about, let's say, the solid Earth or the atmosphere or the ocean, that's the province of geophysics. It answers quantitatively the physical and chemical and numerical questions related to any part of the Earth system. Okay? And the objective is shown right here, and that is to devise nutritionally and geophysically optimal diets that each one of us can strive to achieve in his or her own life, but more importantly, perhaps, that farm policy can try to promote. So an example would be land, okay? So agriculture is by far the largest land user globally and in the US. And here is what land is used for agriculturally in the US, okay? That's for 2009. And you see the total is shown right here, and it's 47% of the entire US, including Alaska and the Great Lakes and so forth. Okay, so half of the country is devoted to feeding the nation. New England, all of the New England states occupy 1.8 by comparison to this, and these are the other large agricultural uses. So you see that 21% goes to rangeland, you know, Bureau of Land Management in Wyoming, Montana, northern Texas, and so forth. That's what land is used for, and there's nothing that comes even close to that. And therefore, obviously, if you choose to eat one versus another, that choice has a footprint on this. It says, it dictates the fraction of that total to which you are responsible for. So you might want to think about it in those terms. Another important aspect of the impact of food choices on the physical environment has to do with the surface radiative budget. Okay, so I understand this might be a little hairy, so let's talk about it. Squint your eyes and think about a small planet suspended mid-air and a big sun overhead, like here, shining light on it. That's the basis of planetary heat balance. How much is coming into the planet from the host star, and how much the planet is able to emit and rid itself of the excess heat it absorbs, okay? Now, global warming is about the latter, is about how effective is the atmosphere, is the Earth in shining long-wave radiation through the atmosphere back into the heavens. And that's a big deal in the news all the time and so forth. And you can hear priceless pearls of wisdom from Senator Inhofe and the likes about it. However, there is an equally important and vastly less talked about component to that, and that is solar radiation. Okay? And agriculture affects that very strongly because agricultural land reflects about a quarter of all the solar light shining its way, as compared to only 10% of forests and as little as 6% in prairies, the natural environment that typically agriculture or cropland will replace. Okay? So that has a very significant impact, and to drive it home in a simple, easy to digest, pun intended, form, let's think about the following example. Take two pieces of land, one crops, the other natural, okay? And ask yourself this: if they start at 8 a.m. at the same temperature, call it T sub I, okay? What would their respective temperatures look like at 2 p.m. given the different reflectivities of solar radiation? And the answer is, it can be as high as 1 degree cooler where the crops are, about 1 degree cooler. Now, you might say, this is degree Kelvin, not Fahrenheit. You might say, what's the big deal, 1 degree? Well, it's about half of or so of our best estimate of what will be the overall response of the surface temperature to doubling atmospheric CO2 from 280 parts per million pre-industrial to 560, okay? So this is a very large and opposite sign impact of agriculture. And each time you make a choice of eating this versus that, you impact that, okay? Another key element of the natural environment is cycling. You know, energy changes forms and goes from one place to another in different guises. Well, same thing with elements like nitrogen, oxygen, and so forth. They go through various pools, various reservoirs, and there are fluxes between them. And these are called biogeochemical cycles because they're all mediated by both biology and chemistry. Okay? One key macronutrient, or one of those elements that is a macronutrient in our bodies as well as in those of other living forms, is nitrogen. Okay? And when you make a dietary choice, you determine the amount, for example, as shown in this picture, the amount of nitrogen, biologically active nitrogen, that goes from the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the Gulf of Mexico suffered a great deal under the yoke of the BP catastrophe. That happened once, and until the next time, that's it. We only have one realization of that. Well, this environmental problem of coastal dead zones occurs pretty much every summer, and it occurs pretty much at the mouth of every major river in the world, throughout the global coastal ocean, okay? And the way it works, just physically, very briefly, is that those nutrient-rich waters from, in this case, the Mississippi, enter the top of the water column, and there, sunshine make the algae very happy. Normally, their abundance is limited by the availability of nitrogen. Because of the Mississippi spewing all this water into it, that limitation is completely removed. So the algae are just having an orgy right here. And they live a short and perhaps bacchanal life, and then they fall down and they sink. They sink to the bottom, and then they decompose, just like if you, let's say, went somewhere for 2 weeks and left a head of lettuce in the bottom of your fridge, you come back, it's not exactly great. That consumes oxygen, and that happens in your fridge, and it happens near the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, removing dissolved oxygen and resulting in widespread death of any life form. Okay? So there are compelling reasons to try to minimize some of those geophysical impacts, if we can. Against this backdrop, it is useful to have a single measure of the simple efficiency. What is the ratio of the edible energy that you get out of something over the fossil fuel energy that you need to put in order to get that thing? Okay, so for example, let's take 22 for chicken. That means if you put in 100 kilocalories of fossil fuel, you get 22 edible chicken kilocalories to eat. Okay? Now, if you take all the animal categories that we have and compare them to all the plant categories that we have data for, you get what's shown right here. About 12% efficiency is the average for animal-based items, and it's about 220 for plants. So it's complete lack of disparity. So in the paper that caught, I guess, some people's attention, that's now getting a little old, we described the impact of that as the impact of eating the mean American diet versus eating pure plants as having the effect was to save 1.5 tons of CO2 per person per year. So again, just to compare, this bar is just an average American eating a fixed number of calories, and this is another American eating the same number of calories, but from plants. The latter person is responsible for the emissions of 1.5 tons of CO2 less than the former person, okay? And that amounts to about 7% of the total national greenhouse gas portfolio. All right, so now suppose, let's skip that in the name of brevity, and let's go here and ask ourselves this. Suppose I were concerned with those things and forget about greenhouse gas for a minute, okay? And let's just talk about land and reactive nitrogen. Suppose I want to minimize both in my choices, okay? The mathematical machinery is outside of the scope of this class, but the mathematical machinery, you put in various items that are viable choices to eat, and this gives you a diet, how much of each of those you eat. And you ask yourself, what would that diet that strives to optimize those things look like? Well, it comprises mostly grain, then oils, very little veggies, and a tiny bit more fruit. That's surprising, I think. Most people would agree that's somewhat surprising. So it's a diet perhaps not ideal in terms of nutrition. Perhaps Marion, if she were here, would have taken strong issue with that. If she takes issue with anything, it's strong. So in this case, we're meeting only a very modest set of nutritional requirements. We are meeting them, and every one of the diets here meet those requirements, but there's a lot more to human nutrition than the requirements that we meet. Okay? Now, you may say, well, okay, this is a kind of an odd and perhaps unexpected diet. What is the impact of that diet in terms of saving both land and reactive nitrogen? Does it do the trick or not? Well, that's answered right here. So you see, there are 4 clouds of points. Here is a cloud, here is a cloud, etc. Each cloud comprises 1,000 points. Each point should be thought of as a single person subsisting for a year on some diet. Okay? All of the people here, you see 4,000 people here, all of them eat the same number of calories, the same amount of fat, protein, etc. But they are very different in how much land they require. You see, the pure plant diets require about half an acre per person per year. These mixed diets that are like the American diet require upward of 0.8. And similarly, while the pure plant diets require only 19 pounds of nitrogen per person per year. These diets require something like 64, a huge, staggering difference. Okay? Now, so one way to try to understand those numbers is to look at the inherent efficiency of individual animal-based foods. And you see them right here. And here are your friends, the eggs. And you see that they're really quite good. Okay? Beef, on the other hand, or the opposite extreme, is very, very inefficient. All right? Now, let's cut to the chase here and ask ourselves this. Of all the resources that we allocate to providing the nation with the animal-based foods that it currently consumes, which of our sources exerts the most burden? Which one exerts the least? This is shown by the pie charts over here. Okay? So, for example, land. I showed you that 47% of all the land in the nation goes to food production. Some fraction of that goes to producing animal-based calories. Which of the categories claim the most? That's shown right here. It's not really subtle. Okay, 93% of all the land used to derive animal-based calories goes to beef alone. Okay, and then you have dairy. That's this little sliver right here, and all the rest, forget about it. Okay, in terms of reactive nitrogen, which is the cause of those dead zones, you see 77 and so forth. So now I want to conclude with one thing, which is a dialogue I've been having with Michael for a very long time, unbeknownst to him mostly. And that is, you know, I know the omnivores pretty much by heart. I know it like a religious Jew knows the gospel, okay? And I can recite numbers from that like nobody's business. And I remember this guy, Joel, telling Michael that he gets 400 cow days per acre per year from his pasture, and that's tops. Okay? Well, perhaps it is so. But we want to ask ourselves this. Suppose we were all becoming disciples of Joel, and we were all asking, can we eat the same number of beef calories we currently eat from grass-fed beef? That's answered by this panel right here. Okay? What you see here is the productivity of the land, and here is polyphase, 400 cow days per acre per year. Perhaps true, perhaps not, who knows, but let's say it is true. Okay? And here is how much land is needed to produce that number of calories. Now, this is grass-fed. Those blue lines show you upper and lower bound of how much land is needed. When you have very low productivity land, obviously you need a lot of land, natural. Okay? So there's no comparison between any of the options of grass-fed beef and any of the alternatives. Here you see intensive beef, beef like that, or over here you see the same number of calories from dairy, and all the way at the bottom from plants. No comparison. Now, what about if we really take Joel literally and say, that's how much he gets, and that's how much every other person in the Southeast can, if they put their mind to it. Can we do that? Well, this is how much land will be needed. You come here, that's 400. You come here, and you go over here, and you get to 1.1, something like that. Okay? Now, compare that to getting the same number of calories from either dairy or plants. There's about a factor of 4. Okay? Now, furthermore, does the grass-fed beef outperform intensive beef? Only in ridiculously high and highly unlikely yields. In other words, if we were to try to scale polyphase up to a national beef supply system, we would be somewhere around here. Being somewhere around here, requiring as much land as this, these lines are above this 0 line, is suboptimal in the extreme. So no, the answer is no. Okay, so I overstepped my welcome here, so let me just tell you my conclusions. They are as follows. Ag-related personal choices and policy tweaks can yield significant potential environmental savings. Most plants outperform animals with important exceptions. Eggs are by far the most environmentally desirable, and beef the reverse, and grass-fed beef, alas, no exception. Some very serious environmental problems are essentially optional for while maintaining a fixed standard of living. That you will have to take mostly at face value, because I didn't have time to actually shore this argument up, but trust me, shored up it is. All right.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. I love that. That was absolutely fascinating. And it's going to be quite a contrast to what I'm going to do, because I'm going to tell you my life story, sort of. And I haven't had a chance to be back here, and I'm taking advantage of it to paint the big picture. So I'm going to take you on a 40-year journey in half an hour or less. And this journey has taken me to the foothills of the Himalaya, to the outback of Brazil, and I am still on this journey. So what I am going to share tonight is really what are the questions that have been pushing me along this path. And hopefully they will be helpful to you. And it all began just a few hundred yards from here, as I was sitting at the Giannini Library. And this was the late 60s, and we were told that the earth was running out of food to feed people. And I thought, if I could just understand why hunger in the world, that would unlock a lot of mysteries of economics and politics. And so here I am in the late 60s. See, I'm really trying to figure it out. And that furrowed brow. So, okay. I sat in the library and literally put two and two together. And pretty soon in the process, I realized, hey, wait a minute, folks. There's more than enough food for all of us to eat well, and that's more true today. And so my question kept growing and growing. And it became, okay, why are we, this really bright species, creating a food system that has actually become a health hazard? How could that come to be? How could we turn beef into disposal systems, in a sense? So I pushed that question, and then finally it came to this question. I wanted to know, why are we together creating a world that none of us as individuals would ever choose? And that seemed to me, if I could figure that one out, then that would help. Okay, now I've had a lot of great teachers. Sorry, got a little dry there. I've had a lot of great teachers over these 4 decades, and gradually I came to see that the unique thing about the human mind is that we see the world through a certain map, through a lens, through a frame. And that's all well and good if our mental map is life-serving. But unfortunately, ours today is not. But just to give you an idea of the power of a mental map is that we all absorb these in our cultures. We literally cannot see what's not inside our mental map. I want to give you a very homey illustration of how these things work. Okay, last Thanksgiving, I got up so excited to make my favorite root vegetable dish for 33 people coming in the afternoon. And I went right to the cupboard where I knew it was, and it wasn't there. I looked up, I looked down, I looked in the basement, and it wasn't there. Well, I gave up. But sometime later, I turned around, and there it was. Only it had a plant in it. And so, you get it? No, you don't get it. In other words, I was looking for a kitchen item, but because I'd put a plant in it, maybe this will help. There it is. Because I'd put a plant in it, I didn't see it, even though the thing is red, right? So I'm saying the power of the frame, the mental map that we absorb, is that we can't see something right in front of our noses if it doesn't fit inside of our mental map. Understand? Does that make sense? Okay, so that was a big clue for me. So what I started then trying to figure out, what is the dominant mental map that would have us creating a world that none of us as individuals would choose? And over the decades, this is what my tentative hypothesis is, that we start this downward spiral of creating this world that none of us would choose from a premise of scarcity, that there's not enough of anything. First of all, we are separate in this world. We're separate, competing creatures. There's not enough of anything. There's not enough goods. Certainly there's not enough food, not enough energy, and there's not enough goodness. Not enough goods or goodness. And from there, then what happens? We believe that we are incapable of coming together in common problem solving, incapable of that thing called democracy. So we believe we can't trust government. What we have to do is turn over our fate to some magical force. That's what Ronald Reagan called it, the magic of the market. And that will determine outcomes for us. But the problem is we hit upon this kind of wacky idea that a market driven by one rule, that is highest return to existing wealth, will create benign outcomes for all of us. And so what happens is wealth accrues to wealth accrues to wealth until we have the point that people who could fit in about half, could fill only about half of this auditorium, control as much wealth as the bottom half of the U.S. population put together, 400 people. And so then that tight concentration of wealth infuses and infects our political system. And so what then happens? Well, we have what I've come to call a privately held government, which should be an oxymoron. That means that there are now 24 lobbyists for every person that you and I elect to represent us in Washington. And that then, what happens then is that public decisions get distorted away from what makes common sense to all of us, that is, a food system that would work for everyone. And so it's not just fossil fuel industry, but of course the agribusiness industry spending $120 million a year to push its agenda, which has led then to subsidized monocropping, which leads to inexpensive grain, which leads to the kind of beef-centered diet that the Americans have come to take as our way of life. But my point is that this follows from the starting with this assumption of lack. And then we end up then with increasing inequities. In fact, in U.S. farming today, I've just learned that it's only the top 10% of us in farming that can actually earn enough income from farming to support a household. So power inequities increase, and then we say, see, look what happens. There's massive hunger in the world. See, there really isn't enough. Even here in the U.S., this big food exporter, half of our children will be on food stamps at some point in their childhood. So we actually confirm then the very scarcity that we start out as the premise. So, okay, now the problem is, when we get to that point, is that we get to a point where we are actually, what my sense of this, we get to the point that we are actually perversely aligning our very economic and political system with what we know about nature and human nature. And so I just want to stay there for just a moment on this premise of not enough goodness, because that is really where it all starts, that human beings are basically selfish, materialistic, and competitive, and that's all we can really count on. So actually, there is a revolution underway in understanding of human nature, that indeed we evolved in tightly knit tribes with some very profound capacities that's out of place. I had to do some last minute switching. That we evolved with these very pro-social qualities, okay? And in fact, one I love, experiment I was just reading about cooperation, when they look at our brains while we're competing and we're cooperating, it turns out when we cooperate that our brains are stimulated as if we were eating chocolate. It's that pleasant. So we know that we have what it takes to shift from this premise of lack of goodness that starts this whole spiral of disempowerment going. Okay. We know now that there's tremendous evidence that these qualities exist in us. But if we're so good, then if we have all these things, if we're so great, how did we get into this mess? And here is where the ecological thinking comes into play. Okay, we have to admit that we know now that not just a few of us, but most of us will behave quite brutally under the wrong conditions. We know that the Holocaust was not caused by one madman and some sadistic guards, that ordinary people, millions of them, participated. We know that in that prison experiment, at Stanford in '71, where some people were put in the position of guards, some as prisoners, that indeed they had to stop this experiment after 6 days. These were ordinary young people. They had to stop it halfway through because, as Professor Zimbardo, the lead on that experiment, said that the guards were treating the prisoners so brutally it looked like Abu Ghraib. He has said that recently. So we know that we have both. But this is quite freeing, I'm suggesting. And this is quite freeing because once we can see that both of these capacities are in us, then we have some idea of where to go. And that is what I'm suggesting, that we know now what brings out the best in us and what brings out the worst in us. I'm saying the worst in us, we have tremendous evidence from history and these lab experiments that these qualities of these conditions of concentrated power, of secrecy, think of what happened on Wall Street when they thought nobody was looking, and the blame game, which is so evident in our culture today, brings out the worst in us. And at the same time, we know what brings out the best in us, the continuing dispersion of power, transparency in human relationships, and mutual accountability. Now, where is all this going? This is my journey of 40 years, because I think it is these qualities that are actually emerging around the world in people who are breaking free from the scarcity trap. And it is showing up in many aspects of the global food movement, and that is what keeps me going, is the realization that it is possible that human beings have the capacity to shift our mental frame. And we can actually, with our new thoughts, create new mental pathways, we learn. And so what is emerging is what I call the spiral of empowerment, that starts with a very different premise, that as we align now with what we know about our nature, what brings out the worst and the best, and what we know about nature itself, that we can begin from a very different place, that we know we have the capacities that are required to make this turn toward life, that we are capable of deliberative problem solving, and it's possible to remove the power of money from politics in order to be freed from the grip of private wealth, to keep a market that is open and fair so that all have access to it and all can eat healthfully. And this continues on to reinforce the positive, to reinforce a spiral of empowerment. And the reason I put power right at the center here, from powerlessness to empowerment, is this, is that I think that actually we know the solutions, whether it's to climate change, to world hunger and poverty, solutions are known. What is missing is our feeling of power to actually manifest the solutions. And so this is the spiral that I see emerging, where people are actually ending hunger and solving the climate crisis. Now, what happens when we shift to this way of seeing is that, is that we begin then also to register that the climate crisis is not just about this. We shift from just a quantitative more and less frame to a relational frame of, are the relationships empowering in our lives, in our societies, in our world? And so we start to look at the climate crisis a bit differently too. We register that the challenge is not just cutting emissions, the challenge is balancing the carbon cycle, in which then agriculture and farming, in the ways that we do it, is all important, as you all know now. And so that is the key then. And what happens with that shift, and what happens with this shift away from this quantitative fixation to this relational way of seeing in this frame, is that we begin to value the small farmers throughout the world who are caring for the soil in a way that can actually store carbon. In other words, the evidence is that from 25 to as much as 40% of the excess carbon in the atmosphere today is from soil, this disturbance of soil, the degradation of soil. And so throughout the world where people are using techniques of agroecology and agroforestry to restore the quality of the soil, they become the climate heroes. And so then we start to see possibility where we didn't see it before. And so even, this is what is so exciting to me, is that even, the poorest people that we think of kind of the burden on the rest of the world, they have a big part of the solution. And that's what I just want to mention 3 examples from the rest of the world that give us a glimpse of how that is happening throughout the world. One is one of the poorest countries in the world, Niger. And I bet if you've even heard of Niger in the last year, it's been in relation to famine. But while nobody was looking, over the last couple of decades, farmers in Niger have begun to nurture trees that they before thought were controlled by the state. They've begun to nurture trees, realize that they can be part of a healthy agriculture. They help to hold the soil in place in this area that had become very desert-like. They help, in certain trees, help improve the nutrient qualities in the soil. And the trees then provide fodder, provide fruit, and provide firewood. And so over fewer than 2 decades, 12.5 million acres of land have been regreened in Niger. And they have allowed this they have encouraged the nurturing of 200 million trees that are creating food security for 2.5 million people in Niger. And the Dutch sustainable agricultural expert who's been filling me in on all this because I've been fascinated by it, I said, Chris, why doesn't everybody know about this? And he said, Frankie, nobody thought to look. With the GPS, they just never thought that anything like this could happen on a regional scale. And so I thought that was so interesting. So I want to jump to another place in the world that is also teaching similar lessons, because we hear, of course, so often that the answer for the third world is just our system of capital and chemical intensive agriculture. I want to take you to one of the large southern states in India that has been called the pesticide capital of the world, because people there got hooked on heavy use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. But over time, they were paying half of everything that they got for their crops. They were paying in the cost of seeds and fertilizers and pesticides. They were getting sick from the seed. They were getting sick from the pesticide use. In some cases, children were applying pesticides and getting sick from it. And so there has been, again, not with big flashy news coming out of it, but have been a movement variously called community managed agriculture and the non-pesticide movement in Andhra Pradesh, India. I don't think I mentioned the name of the state. Andhra Pradesh, India. Pesticide capital of the world, it's been called. And now they are saying no. And village by village by village, now touching 8,000 villages, they are reclaiming their traditional seeds. They have a seed caravan every year going village to village. And these women here, what are they doing? They are pledging to participate in the protection of biodiversity in their villages. Now, 300,000 farmers are taking this step, creating new food security. And if you remember back on what are the conditions that bring out the best in us, I'm suggesting they are the dispersion of power, transparency in human relationships, and mutual accountability. And here these women are stepping up, putting their hands out, saying, we are committed to protecting biodiversity and not using chemicals in our villages. So this is growing, and now the state of Andhra Pradesh is behind it. I'll give you one more example that I found. I kind of almost, anyway, I ended up in this city in Colombia, Manizales, and I learned that coffee is a huge polluter because of a huge problem, because there's so much coffee waste. The coffee waste then rots and produces methane, which you know is a very fierce greenhouse gas. And so I ended up in a, okay. Anyway, sorry, I had some confusion with, I'll just visualize this. Women who took the big mountain, you'll see a big mountain of coffee, and then used it for mushroom substrate. These were women who had no employment, and right in the barrio in this city in Colombia in South America, and were producing these beautiful mushrooms from it. So it's another example of their stepping up, mutual accountability, stepping up themselves, but also aligning with nature so that they are taking something that would have been a hazard and are actually creating this high-grade nutrition from it, and then whatever waste they have in that process they are using for livestock feed. So this is the kind of thing that I'm saying in this big sweep of what my journey has been, the kind of approach then that moves us from the premise of scarcity to the premise of possibility as we align with nature. And so this also involves this journey toward a true living democracy that embodies the qualities that bring out the best in us, is also creating new forms of governance having to do with food and farming. And I just mentioned a few here that have struck me. One of them is the phenomenon of a citizen's jury, where randomly people are chosen to sit on a jury to decide the direction of their whatever, in this case, the direction of farming and food in Mali. And so they come together, all small farmers, large farmers, people from academia and business, et cetera, and they discuss, okay, what kind of agriculture do we want? After this particular citizens' jury, they decided that they did not want to import genetically modified organisms, but the farmers' primary message is, we want to be involved in the research. We want to be involved in the direction of research in agriculture. Then, of course, you've heard probably about food policy councils that are taking off in the United States. There are now 100 of them. I was just in Hawaii, where the governor of Hawaii was elected on the platform of food self-sufficiency and sustainability in Hawaii. I had no idea. And he's working there with the Food Council, which is an independent group of stakeholders in the food system, helping to democratize and to make it more sustainable. And then another example of democratic, stepping up and holding one another accountable to create the world that we want is an example from India, which is so stunning. There are now 10 million households in India that are organized democratically in their villages to protect their forests, because they are sources not of found food, but also of firewood and building materials. And they are responsible for, there are now 100,000 forest management groups that take care of the forests and devolved from the central government. And experts say that this is one reason that forest cover is expanding in India, unlike elsewhere. Okay, so that's something of what I wanted to share with you. And now I want to jump to the more personal part. I'm going to have to jump over, well, let me see. How can I do this really fast? I'm just going to give you the headlines of what I was going to say before I get to the, Brazil. I threw Brazil in here because Brazil represents to me what happens when you take this to the national level. That citizens movement created a workers' party 20 years ago that then led to the creation of the actually ability to elect a president, Lula, who created a program called Zero Hunger, and he just won the World Food Prize because in 8 years of his administration, he cut the rate of hungry people by half. It's called Zero Fome, and here's a picture of kids that Anna and I met in Brazil who are some of the beneficiaries of that program. But this then reminds us that to really begin this process of moving out of the spiral of disempowerment to the spiral of empowerment means that we have to move here toward a real democracy, which means getting money out of politics and our voices in. And so just to introduce you to Deb Simpson there from Maine, who, because there are clean elections in Maine, you don't have to be dependent on corporations to be elected. She, a single mom, a waitress, is my hero because she's been elected now 4 terms. And this is the goal then of, this is what I've learned from this 40 years, that I want to be part of this movement to get money out of politics. Now, I want to close by just moving to the more personal part. And my 40 years has led me to believe that what's required of me is what I like to call bold humility. And what I mean by that is that I believe you now know that human beings are good enough. We have these marvelous qualities in us. But because we evolved in these tightly knit tribes in which separating from the pack was the scariest thing of all, it's very difficult now that when the hyper tribe is about to go over Victoria Falls, in other words, is taking us in the wrong direction, then, okay, we've got to separate. But it still brings up fear in us. And so we have to rethink fear too, not just this cycle of disempowerment. We have to really rethink how we relate to fear. And so when my daughter and I were in Kenya, we got a great lesson from Wangari Maathai, who is my hero of all heroes. She passed away on September 25th. She is the founder of the Green Belt Movement and the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. But what Wangari stands for me is this transformation of understanding that fear means that we have to stop, that we're in the wrong place, wrong time, get out of there, freeze, fight, flee. No, fear could mean that we are exactly where we should be, doing exactly what we need to be doing. And in that sense, it is just something to work with. So I'll share with you my cheesy gimmick that I use, see if it maybe works for you. When I get scared, my heart goes bum, 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 bum. And I used to say, you wimp. And now I say, inner applause. And it kind of works some of the time. But but there's a final piece here. There's the bold, and now there's the humility piece. What do I mean by bold humility? I mean this, that if we really have this ecological perspective of continuous change and connection with, which is the heart of the EcoMind, that we see that everything is in constant motion, everything created by everything else, and that means then that the only choice we don't have is whether to change the world, because every choice we are making is changing the world. It also means that I looked and realized that the things that most inspire me today, some of them I'm showing you tonight, I realized I would never have predicted when I was my daughter's age, for example. And so this is the other message then that I take from my exposure to Wangari, is that she planted 7 trees on Earth Day in 1977, and people said, oh, well, that's nice. They became 45 million trees as part of her Greenbelt movement. And then when she was chosen to win the Nobel Peace Prize, then she connected with the UN environmental program, and those 45 million trees, then they cooked up this idea of a 1 billion tree a year campaign called Plant for the Planet. Now, at each point along the way, including that 1 billion tree, I would have said, that's not really likely. That's pretty ambitious. Well, I looked at that Plant for the Planet campaign that was started, remember it, for 1 billion trees in a year starting in 2007 with Wangari's inspiration, and now we are at 11 billion trees, right? So the final thought that I come to with this shift from the scarcity mind to what I call the EcoMind, the sense of possibility as we start from the premise of alignment rather than this premise of scarcity, then I come to this realization that with this perspective of continuous change and connection, it is simply not possible to know what's possible. And that's what gives me then a sense of freedom. Thank you so much.
And they will turn it up. Ha-ha! It has been turned up. So to start off the panel, I wanted to connect some of the things that we heard tonight with some of the things that were said in our class last week. Because one of the main points I think that Alice was trying to make is that we don't know what's possible. She knows edible schoolyards should be the thing that schools are built around when it comes to not only educating students, but feeding students. How we're going to pay for it, we know that it's cheaper. How we're going to get to what we're spending our money on now, to spending our money on that, you, smart people, go do it. Because it's the right thing to do. You will figure it out if you have the value. And so one of the wonderful things I think about Francis Moore Lappé's presentation tonight is that this was actually a kind of a tangible map of how you get from one mind to another. This is how you're thinking in scarcity. This is how you don't know what's possible. Then you will be able to actually enact the things that you are dreaming into. And Gidon, awesome, been mispronouncing his name all night, is one of those smart people that can actually tell you environmentally what's the equation. This is how much it's going to cost, and this is what you're going to spend in terms of the planet to do that thing. So I think the first question that I have is Francis. It occurred to me listening to your speech that you have to want to have the EcoMind in order to switch over. And I think I've genuinely spoken to people who just values-wise aren't in the EcoMind. Like they actually like profits. They actually like the way the world is now. And it doesn't occur to them that it's wrong to patent a seed. Most people are not like that, but I feel like there are a few folk that actually do think that that's okay. So if you're talking to someone like that, how would you describe the EcoMind or try to get them on the same page? What would you do with that?
Oh, okay. I have voice. Well, I start from the assumption that all of us want to have a sense of meaning and power and purpose, and I first of all, I guess the way I function in life is that, while I'm sure you're right that when you think of the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street movement, which I think should be the Occupy democracy movement, actually, that the vast majority of us know that something is profoundly off, and so I guess that's what I'm most eager to be part of, is how do we give shape and real strength and power to that, not so much concerned about the folks who don't see a problem. Because actually I heard, did you hear yesterday on BBC, they were interviewing some bankers or did a survey of bankers in London who the majority said that they thought they were paid too much. Yes, yes. And the other really interesting thing, they said that they thought the deregulation of banking led to unethical behavior, but they also said that it was necessary. So there's a lot of psychic dissonance going on there. But I think that the real energy, and I think what we're all about, if I can be so bold, is that, you know, we know that vast majority of people really do know that something is profoundly wrong. And it's helping us find that, sometimes I use this really homey metaphor of a bucket, you know, that we always, you hear people say, oh, I'm just a drop in the bucket, as if that's really just nothing. But being a drop in the bucket is great if you can see the bucket, right? Because the buckets fill up fast on a rainy night. And so I think what we all want to be part of is helping to define that bucket that we're all contributing to make things really turn around. So that's not an answer to your question.
No, that's a great answer, because I actually realized when you started speaking, that was an example of me coming from the deficit scarcity mind, because I was focusing on those 3 people that I've spoken to who really got to me, instead of the 97% of people who are actually on my page, which would be asset-based. Aha! Now, we will take some questions from the audience. Students. 1 student there, and 1 more question from student, 1 student over there. Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to piggyback on your comment, Nikki. Do you think that it's actually, this eco-mindset is actually compatible or achievable within our current political economic system, this profit-based mentality that we have? Do you think that we could actually create a political shift where this could exist within the greater capitalist framework?
And we stack 2 questions at a time. So this question is that EcoMind actually possible within the current framework that we're working in? And then we'll take the second question real quick. Yeah? So how did that reduction of hunger in Brazil actually happen? Those are the 2 questions.
Well, I had the privilege of visiting a city in Brazil that became the model for Lula after he was elected. It's the city of Belo Horizonte. And they had elected a government, an administration in '93 that had run on the platform of food as a human right. And what they did, instead of just lengthening the soup lines, they actually called the community together. All segments of the community came together on a council and came up with literally dozens of innovations, everything from buying local organic food instead of corporate food with the money that they were given from the federal government for schools, to taking eggshells and something else, and grinding it into flour and creating really nutritious rolls for nursery schools. And they took land that was owned by the government, little spots of land right in the inner city in the poorest areas, and they made it available to local organic farmers if they would keep it into the price range of the poorest people, and on and on. And so that then became a model. But one of the big things that Lula did is that became a model that was replicated. But one of the big things that the Lula administration did was institute a Bolsa Família, which is basically a monetary stipend for families who are very, very poor. And they get this if they keep their kids in school and if they get them the basic medical care they need, so that the kids who had to work their families have some money so that they can actually stay in school. And that was a huge factor. And 30% of all food now in school lunches in Brazil has to be locally provisioned. So that's another factor that is helping the smallest farmers around the big cities. And as of 2010, food was, as a human right, was put into the Brazilian constitution. So there are many, many things working there. But it started with citizens who said, okay, we want a party that represents us. And that was in 1980, and it built from there.
And what about EcoMind? Is it possible in our current government?
Well, in my little sketch there, I mean, I think that, and I think 80-something% of Americans agree that corporations have too much sway in Washington. So the key is that for me to answer that, my answer is that we have to believe enough in ourselves and believe in enough that it's not possible to know what's possible to go for it, to believe we can get money out of its grip on our political system. Franklin Roosevelt said in 1938, the liberty of democracy is not free. If a people tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it is stronger than the democratic state itself, that, in its essence, is fascism. So we've got to get money out of the system. And we can't say it's impossible. It's not possible to know what's possible. So there are two, there's the Fair Elections Now legislation in both houses. Did you ever hear about Fair Elections Now legislation? That would give people like Deb Simpson in Maine, she ran in the state, people like that a chance to run. And I don't want to go on and on, but there are two things right now we could do that Obama could sign an executive order tomorrow that would go a long way to making it transparent what corporations are giving money to, which I think would really inhibit. So anyway, trying to jump to the answer is that I think that it is possible to create a democratic market, meaning that we are, as citizens, creating a boundary, a values boundary within which the market works that keeps it open, fair, and competitive. And what kills the market is monopoly power, not a democratic government. So just flipping it around to say it's up to us to keep the market open, fair, and democratic, and that means getting money out and getting our voices in. So,
thank you. All right, next couple of questions. One back there and one over there. Mm-hmm. Was there a question in there? Got it. Okay, so the vast majority of people are still consumers who don't know where stuff comes from. How do we actually get to the vast majority of people considering the pace of change that we need to move at, considering where the world is now? Okay, that was a question, and then question over here. Ooh, ha. Yeah, let's go right to that. So, so we're going to answer that question first. And that question was, there's a lot of really good-hearted people in the food movement who do like eating meat. So how does one defend that, considering that it seems like beef is actually the devil?
Oh,
that's for you.
I don't know much about the devil. I think that my message was that it's actually, with possible exception of beef, meat is actually pretty subtle. The difference, for example, between pork and poultry on the one hand and some other plant-based options are actually not as dramatic as I used to think. And there's some semblance of parity. Perhaps plants still outperform across the board all forms of meat. That's not perhaps, that is the fact. But the difference in the case of poultry or pork is such that it's not that different from asking, well, how can a person be an environmentalist and yet go anywhere, actually? You know, I mean, I want to tell you, I go to incredible lengths to commute by bike, and I spend, you know, I spend 7 hours a week on a bike just to get to work and back. But do I not go anywhere? I just flew here. How do you think I got here? So it's all balance, you know, and nobody is without blame. Nobody's an angel. And yes, I think you can be a perfectly good person and eat meat, even beef on occasion. It would be nice if you keep it down, but...
Frankie, where are you on that question? I mean, a lot of your early work was a pretty devastating indictment of meat eating. Do you think there's a place for it in the mind of, or in the behavior of someone seeking to reform the food system or be a good environmentalist?
Well, I try to be ecumenical, you know. I try not, I mean, I haven't eaten meat since I got caught at the smokehouse on Telegraph Avenue when I had a craving when I was pregnant with my first child. That was my last meat. Well, that's not quite true. I did eat some of my mother-in-law's chopped liver. That was a duty. But, you know, I think this plant, what I call my diet, though, is a plant and planet-centered diet. So I think that you know, that is a direction, that the more that we can move toward a plant, for all sorts of reasons, for health, you know, for every sort of reason, as we can have a more plant-based diet, that's what I advocate. But I try not to be too, because I don't think people are motivated when you're wagging a finger in their face. And, you know, I think the joy of what I wrote in Diet, which is still so true today, is that all the variety and the colored and the taste differences are all in the plant world, you know? So it's not, it doesn't, for me, it's never been a you should. It's, oh my God, look at all the possibilities with plant foods. And so I think the more that we can, I think we're going to be more successful the more we approach it that way. So that's how I handle it.
We have time for a couple more? Yes. That's you. So it's a long, complicated question, but it really has to do with context. Does the calculation of energy use or carbon footprint, if we want to call it that, change depending on the fact that you're in, say, outer Mongolia or in the Central Valley of California?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is emphatically yes. It can change, and it all depends on the context. The numbers that I give are mostly the numbers that a person can really look at and trust, the numbers from which it is derived, namely the US mean diet, okay? So that's mostly CAFOs and so forth. At the same time, and I also answered and I think conclusively, the answer about grass-fed, that's a canard, okay? Now, if you ask me about the steppes of Mongolia, I have no idea. I mean, nobody knows. Nobody has the data necessary. And without that, it's just guessing.
I don't accept this point about grass-fed meat being completely closed, and we don't have time to argue about it here, but we will at dinner. And I'll report back if I make any progress whatsoever. I think on that note, we're going to have to wrap up. I want to remind you that Frankie will be out signing her book, which I encourage you to take a look at. And I want to thank our guests for a very illuminating conversation. Thanks.